The name of this program is called Simple Sumer. It's about the way it is. We all want to know how this whole thing got started. And we endeavor to have to go back and dig up the pieces because our species can't remember. It's one of the failed parts of when they made us. And there is a timeline that can, in fact, now be documented. So we look at the Middle East as the beginnings. And within that, there are the cultures and the civilizations of Sumer, Babylon, Assyria, and Persia. Now, this was 2,000 years before the Semites, the Hebrews. If we look at the descent of time, we see that the Sumerians are at the top. And from there, we see the Akkadians arise, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. Now, the Sumerians, again, are here, and there's a reason, because they freed themselves from the Akkadians. And then, as time progressed, we came to the Hittites and the Persians. Now, if you look at the timeline, very simply, you can see that around 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC, the Sumerians arrived in Mesopotamia. Now, folks, it's still a mystery. We do not know where these people came from, how they got here. More interesting about this is that they came fully equipped, plug and play. They had laws, they had knowledge, they had culture, they had a civilization, a society. And maybe one day we'll figure that one out. But right now, it is probably the biggest mystery of our origins. And then around 2340 BC, Sargon, a Sumerian in the city of Kish, overthrows the Sumerian king of Nippur. Now, Sargon's new kingdom is called Akkad. Sargon extends his kingdom to Syria. 2320, Sargon conquers Sumer. 2230, Akkadian dynasty ends. 2150, the nomadics overrun Akkadians in Sumer, but Sumer revives. 2130, Sumer regains independence from the Akkadian rule. 2000, the Hittites migrate to Asia Minor. 1950 BC, Amorites go to Babylon to create colonies with Ashur as the center of the kingdom that will be called Assyria. 2000 to 1600, the first dynasty of Babylon. 1753 BC, the Amorite king Hammurabi conquers all Sumer. Hammurabi rules till 1750 BC, and his empire lasts until 1600 BC. In the year 1593 BC, the Hittites sack Babylon and end Hammurabi's destiny. In 1365, Ashur the Great, the king of Assyria, marries his daughter to a Babylonian. And thus then becomes the modern era of which so many are versed with, particularly with religious theology. Then 1300, the Assyrians control all of Mesopotamia. 1200 BC, the Hittites' capital, Hattusis, is wiped out by a plague. And then history rolls on. Now, in this chart, you can see very clearly how the graph is laid out in documented timelines, thousands of years BC. So we go all the way back to 5000 BC. Again, here are the Sumerians. And what's amazing, there's something that has to be questioned. Something that we have to investigate more is how some of these ancient cities are still here. Where in other places of the world, greater cities, larger, more diverse populations have been wiped clean off of the earth. We see Babylon, then we see the associating timeline of the Akkadians, the Amorites, the Kishnites, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, and then Persia, leading all the way up to the Median Persian Empire. Now, Mesopotamia, has been called the cradle of civilization. We actually know now that there are three. There are two others. But until the books can catch up with the pace of what we're discovering, there will be a lag. Now, Mesopotamia, as it's known, is an ancient region of the Southwest Asia between the Tigris and Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq, probably settled before 5000 BC. There's good evidence. Now, this was home of numerous early civilizations, as I said before, Sumeria, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria. When we think of the modern man, only dates back about 10,000 years. And that classification in the genus line of the Homo species is Homo sapiens sapiens. It is rumored and said that this is where we all originated. All history, all knowledge came here. Well, again, we know that that's not correct. But we have to deal with what we have to deal with right now. The Fertile Crescent is a region of the Middle East arcing across the northern part of the Syrian desert and extending from the Nile River to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And by the way, Mesopotamia only means between the rivers. Most of us are familiar with the legends of the story of religions of how this was how man started, the garden, etc. And this is the region. Now, if you look at the geography of Mesopotamia, the contemporary Iraq occupies the territory that historians traditionally have considered the site of the earliest civilizations of the ancient Near East. Geographically, modern Iraq corresponds to the Mesopotamia of the Old Testament and of older and other Near Eastern texts. In Western mythology and religious traditions, the land of Mesopotamia in the ancient period was a land of lush vegetation, abundant wildlife, and copious, if unpredictable, water resources. As such, at a very early date, it attracted people from neighboring but less hospitable areas. By 6000 BC, Mesopotamia had been settled, chiefly by migrants from the Turkish and Iranian highlands. Another clue. Where did these people come from? Now we're starting to get back 7,000, 8,000 BC. That doesn't jive with a lot of the modern religious theologies of the modern era. Now, the geography and the specialization of the area is unique. The civilized life that emerged at Sumer was shaped by two conflicting factors: the unpredictability of the Tigris and Euphrates River. Anyone that has lived here, where I live here in the United States, has ever lived near a river, know the unpredictability of rivers, which at any time could unleash devastating floods that wiped out entire peoples, and the extreme fusidity of the river valleys caused by century-old deposits of soil. So what happens, and the pioneers did the same thing here in the United States when they came along rivers like the Ohio, the Mississippi, Missouri. These rivers had vast acres of very fertile soil. Yeah, we know why, because it happened where it was previously had flooded, and it made for great growing conditions. But again, the problem is with that, it's ever shifting and it's never going to stay the same. So while the river valleys of southern Mesopotamia attracted migrations of neighboring peoples and made possible for the first time in history the growing of surplus food, and that was the key, folks, the volatility of the rivers necessitated a form of collective management to protect the marshy, low-lying land from flooding. And that was one thing that the Sumerians were very good at. They were masters at channeling rivers and how to use water. As surplus production increased and as collective management became more advanced, a process of urbanization evolved and the Sumerian civilization took root. So, several factors here. One, when they found the area that could grow food reliably. 2, the unpredictability of the abundance of the land due to the rivers. But what the plus side to that was, it grew more food than what the local people could eat. And that is key. That is the one key to population. And so when urbanization began, this changed everything for mankind. Now, in the regional history of the era, Sumer is an ancient name for southern Mesopotamia. Historians are divided on when the Sumerians arrived in the area, but they agree that the population of Sumer was a mixture of linguistic and ethnic groups that included the earlier inhabitants of the regions. Sumer culture mixed foreign and local elements. The Sumerians were highly innovative people who responded creatively to the challenges of the changeable Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Many of the great Sumerian legacies, such as writing, irrigation, the wheel, astronomy, and literature, can be seen as adaptive responses to the great rivers. Boy, does that really put in how life comes from rivers. You can see how this has been woven into modern myths, legends, religions, because it did. Now, Sumerian Cuneiform. This is also very important. The Sumerians were the first people known to have a device, a scheme of written representation as a means of communications. From the earliest writings, which were pictograms, simplified pictures on clay tablets, the Sumerians gradually created a cuneiform, a way of arranging impressions stamped on clay by a wedge-like section of a chopped-off reed. The use of combinations of the same basic wedge shape to stand for phonetic and possibly symbolic elements provided more flexible communication than the pictogram. Through writings, the Sumerians were able to pass on complex agricultural techniques to successive generations. This led to marked improvements in agriculture production. Now think about this. This is the Sumerian alphabet right here. Now look at this. Those who are versed in English, isn't it odd? Here we stand 6,000 plus years later in history, and look how little has changed. You can actually learn cuneiform. You got to ask yourself, folks, so how far have we advanced? Now let's talk about the myths, the legends, the reality of history. Gilgamesh. Another important Sumerian legacy was the recordings of literature. The most famous Sumerian epic, and the one that has survived in the most nearly complete form, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you have not read it, it's online. Get it, read it. You will expand your consciousness. You will expand your awareness. Now, the story of Gilgamesh, who actually was king of the city-state of Uruk in approximately 2700 BC, is a moving story of the ruler's deep sorrow at the death of his friend and of his consequent search for immortality. Other central themes of the story are a devastating flood and the tenuous nature of man's existence. Laden with complex abstractions and emotional expressions, the Epic of Gilgamesh reflects the intellectual sophistication of the Sumerians, and it has served as the prototype of all Near Eastern inundation stories. Christianity, Judaism, Islam. The area also served as religious centers. The precariousness of existence in southern Mesopotamia also led to the highly developed sense of religion. Cult centers, such as Itaru, dating back to 5000 BC, served as important centers of pilgrimage and devotion even before the rise of Sumer. Many of the most important Mesopotamian cities emerged in the areas surrounding the pre-Sumerian cult centers, thus reinforcing the close relationship between a religion and government. The Sumerians were pantheistic. Their gods were more or less personified local elements and natural forces. In exchange for sacrifice and adherence to an elaborate ritual, the gods of ancient Sumer were to provide the individual with security and prosperity. Isn't that what basically all gods are supposed to do? A powerful priesthood emerged to oversee ritual practices and to intervene with the gods. Sumerian religious beliefs also had important political aspects. Decisions relating to land rentals, agricultural questions, trade, commercial relations, and war were determined by the priesthood because all property belonged to the gods. Sound familiar? The priests ruled from their temples called ziggurats, which were essentially artificial mountains of sun-baked brick built with outside staircases that tapered towards a shrine at the top. Now, in the pantheons of the gods, they were as follow: An, or Anu, Lord of Heaven, God of Heaven; Enlil, God of the air and the storms. This is actually the God most likely the Bible, Christianity, and I would say probably the other two religions as well are actually worshiping. They're actually worshiping Enlil. And then there's Enki, God of the water and wisdom, which today in modern religious theology is your Lucifer, your Satan, your snake. And that's how it is. Now, the priest, the bricks, and the cities. Because the well-being of the community depended upon close observation of natural phenomena, scientific or proto-scientific activities occupied much of the priest's time. For example, the Sumerians believed that each of the gods were represented by a number. The number 60, sacred to the god An, was their basic unit of calculation. The minutes of an hour are the national notational degrees of a circle where Sumerian concepts originated. The highly developed agricultural system and the refined irrigation and water control systems that enabled Sumer to achieve surplus production also led to the growth of large cities. Again, more food, more people. The most important city-states were Uruk, Itaru, Kish, Lagash, Agad, Ashkish, Larasa, and birthplace of the prophet Abraham. Or so it's legend. War. What's it good for? Absolutely nothing. Anyway, the emergence of urban life led to further technological advances. Lacking stone, the Sumerians made marked improvements on brick technology, making possible the construction of very large buildings such as the famous ziggurat of Ur. Sumer also pioneered advances in warfare technology. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the Sumerians had developed a wheeled chariot. At approximately the same time, the Sumerians discovered that tin and copper, when smelted together, produced bronze, a new, more durable, and more hardened metal, and thus the Bronze Age. The wheeled chariot and bronze weapons became increasingly important as the Sumerians developed the institution of kingship and as individual city-states began to vie for supremacy. There you go, folks. Now, did some ET come down and teach us this? Why is it that we have a warlike aspect to us? I mean, seriously. Could it be that we represent our creators? Anunnaki? A warlike race? I don't know. Got to ask yourself. So the Sumerian periods. And the first stage would extended roughly from 3360 BC to 2400 BC. The most important political development was the emergence of kings who, unlike the first priestly rulers, exercised distinct political rather than religious authority. Another important feature of this period was the emergence of warring Sumerian city-states, which fought for control of the river valleys in lower Mesopotamia. During the second phase, which lasted from 2400 BC to 2200 BC, Sumer was conquered in approximately 2334 BC by Sargon I, king of the Semitic city of Akkad. Here is a picture depicting what the Sumerians did a lot. They had a lot of leisure time. They played backgammon. Now, isn't it odd today if one simply does a mere cursory study on games and where they originated? Isn't it quite surprising to see over 6,000 years and yet we play the same games? These are depictions of what the marshes, the lowlands look like, and the subsequent how man altered the environment. Buildings. Remember, man is not natural to earth. Man has to change his environment. He cannot live in the open as the animal kingdom can in dealing with such things as weather. Now, we talked about flooding. This was really a big problem, but it was also, on the other hand, a real, how should we say, windfall. Flooding impacted early Mesopotamian societal developments from an architectural and agricultural standpoint. Control and understanding of the rivers was paramount to any society's success in the region. So think about it. Engineering. Yeah, they had engineers. In fact, if it wasn't for the engineers, nearly 6,000 years ago, we wouldn't see where we are today. They conquered the land. They conquered, altered, changed course of water. They couldn't do anything about air, but they could do something about water to the best of their abilities. So as you can see here, how they solved the geographical challenges of the time. Problem number one is that we have a growing community. There is not enough land for us to grow more food. Our people are starving. What should we do? Well, that then leads to the next solution, which is we have moved to nearby plains where there is more room for us to grow crops. There is a river nearby that will provide us with enough water. And remember, back then, the water you could drink. Can't do that today. Well, this led to a second problem. Here in the plains, we have enough food. The only problem is that the great flooded often come from nearby rivers. How do we control the rivers? Well, then that led to a solution number two. To solve out the flood problem, we have built an irrigation system that will not only provide us with enough water, but it will control the rivers so it does not flood us. Well, then this led to another problem. We are very happy with our irrigation system. There is one problem, though. Our irrigation system goes through other settlements, and it's hard to maintain in our small groups. How can our irrigation system be used for us but safely spread across other settlements? Well, man's ingenious. We came up with a solution. We have combined settlements and now live in larger communities. It is safer and easier to maintain our irrigation systems this way. Wait, no, and isn't this odd? So we get one problem, we solve it, then we get another problem. Well, this led to another problem. Problem number four is we are getting attacked by other communities. We don't know how to keep ourselves and our village safe. How can we keep ourselves safe from being attacked? Well, that led to solution four. We have built walls and moats around our communities. These will keep us safe from enemies. Now we feel that we have a good city-state after all these problems. Wow. Come on. You have to admit, we haven't taken hardly a step forward, folks. So the ancient kingdoms, look at them. We talk about Sumer, Egypt, the Hittite Empire. Listen, the Hittites were, well, I'll do a story on them. They're quite an interesting people. From Assyria. I mean, here you go. Now, in the modern religions, they all make use of these cities. And this is, again, an artist's rendition of what it most likely looked like back then. Notice how everything is irrigated, and your house was literally right next to your land, your part of land, and you were responsible for growing food unless you were wealthy enough, where then you would either control the food of the people working the land, or you had the wealth to buy their excess. And which, by the way, led to the first middle-class society. And again, here's another depiction of this. How close the livestock, very efficient. They made the best use and the most efficiency of the land that they had. Now, this is a very interesting one. Jobs. All of us have jobs. Well, would you be surprised to learn that your job dates back thousands of years? Let's just look at the job classification of ancient Sumer. They had accountants, architect, army commander, astrologer, baker, female baker, barber, basket maker, boatman, bowman, brewer, brickmaker, butcher, carpenter, cartwright, cavalryman, cantor, chariot driver, confectioner, cook, cupbearer, female cupbearer, diviner, exorcist, farmer, fisherman, gardener, goldsmith, governor, harpist, herald, female herald, horse trainer, leather dealer, limestone peddler, mayor, merchant, mule stable attendant, musician, female musician, perfume maker, physician, plowman, potter, priest, prophet, queen, king, royal bodyguard, scholar, scribe, female scribe, shepherd, sheriff, singer, female singer, stone carver, tailor, tanner, tavern keeper, female tavern keeper, tax collector, troll collector, veterinarian, visor, weaver, female weaver. Again, how far have we advanced? So let's talk about the societal structure in summary. So around 3200 BC, the first Sumerian cities emerged in the southern part of Mesopotamia. They used earth and water to make bricks for building. Trade brought riches to Sumerian cities. The Sumerians were the first to make wheeled vehicles. Could you imagine the time that, let's say that you lived outside the influence of the Sumerian culture, and you used either a beast of burden or walked. And lo and behold, you come into an outer village, and you see people riding on top of round things. Think about the ease of your burden if you had a wheel. In each Sumerian city-state, the ruler was responsible for maintaining the city walls and the irrigation systems. Each Sumerian city-state had a distinct society hierarchy. Below the king or governor, society had three distinct classes. You had the aristocrat, nobles, who were administrators, priests, and officers in the army. They got rewarded with large estates, more land, more wealth. You had a middle class of business people, school teachers, artisans, and farmers. And then, as it is today, you have the lower class, in this case being slaves, as we all are, who had been captured in war or were disimposed farmers or those sold by their families. Slavery was not stigmatized by race, but was considered a misfortune out of which one could free oneself through service, usually in 3 years. At the base of society were the majority of people, peasant farms. So let's talk about King Sargon I. Who was this cat? Well, Sargon was the first world's empire builder, sending his troops as far as Egypt and Ethiopia. He attempted to establish a unified empire and to end the hostilities among the city-states. Sargon's rule introduced a new level of political organization that was characterized by an even more clear-cut separation between religious authority and secular authority. To ensure his supremacy, Sargon created the first conscript army, a development related to the need to mobilize large numbers of laborers for irrigation and flood control works. Akkadian strength was boosted by the invention of the composite bow, a new weapon made of strips of wood and horn. Now, anyone who's ever shot a bow and arrow, a compound bow, crossbow, know the killing power of what a bow and arrow could do. And now imagine, basically they were using exotic materials back then, much like today dealing with carbon fibers. No difference. The Akkadians, despite their military prowess, were homogenized over southern Mesopotamia that lasted nearly 200 years. Sargon's great-grandson was then overthrown by Gutai, the mountain people from the east. The fall of the Akkadians and the subsequent reemergence of Sumer under the king of Ur, who defeated the Gutai, ushered the third phase of Sumerian history. Now, it's that third phase of Sumerian history where the modern-day patriarch Abraham emerged. In this final phase, which was characterized by the synthesis of Sumerian and Akkadian cultures, the king of Ur established basically a homogeny over much of Mesopotamia. Sumerian supremacy, however, was on the decline. By 2000 BC, the combined attacks of the Amorites, the Semitic people from the west, and the Elamites, the Caucasian people from the east, they had destroyed the third dynasty of The invaders nevertheless carried on the Sumero-Akkadian culture legacy. That's key. As we look at these modern day pictures of Babylon in Iraq, I want you to stop and think about this. This is where our religions come from, our laws come from, our perceptions of who we are. This is a picture from 2003. You can see the American Humvee there. That's Babylon, folks. Think about this. It's older than your Bible, your Quran, your Torah. Yeah. The Amorites. You've heard of them before. Well, the Amorites established cities on the Tigris and the Euphrates River and made Babylon a town to the north, their capital. During the time of their sixth ruler, King Hammurabi, the Babylonian rule encompassed a huge area covering most of the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley from Sumer to the Persian Gulf to the south to Assyria to the north. To rule over such a large area, Hammurabi devised an elaborate administrative structure. His greatest achievement, however, was the issuance of a law code. Did you get that? A law code designed to cause justice to prevail in the country, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong may not oppress the weak. The Code of Hammurabi, not the earliest to appear in the Near East, but certainly the most complete, dealt with land tenure, rent, the position of women, marriage, divorce, inheritance, contracts, control of public order, administration of justice, wages, and labor conditions. Pretty advanced. Now, the legal code, the trend that started in basically making us civil, began at Sumer and had evolved to a new level of complexity. The sophisticated legal principles contained in the code reflect a highly advanced civilization in which social interaction extended far beyond the confines of kingship. Most likely, this is where your 10 Commandments came from. Yeah. The large number of laws pertaining to commerce reflected a diversified economic base and an extensive trading network. In politics, The Hammurabi Code is evidence of a more pronounced separation between religious and secular authority than had existed in ancient Sumer. In addition to Hammurabi's legal code, the Babylonians made other important contributions, notably to the science of astronomy, and they increased the flexibility of cuneiform by developing a pictogram script so that it stood for the syllable rather than the individual word. Now here is Hammurabi's code. The criminal laws dealt with offenses against others. Hammurabi's code limited personal vengeance and encouraged social order. Civil law dealt with private rights and matters such as business contracts, marriage, taxes, and divorce. Much of the Hammurabi's code was designed to protect the powerless. Are you seeing something here? I don't know. How about the Pentateuch? Maybe, I don't know, the Sermon on the Mount. Hammurabi's code provided the punishment should be similar to the crown, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Under this principle, breaking another person's arm in anger is punished by having your own arm broke. For certain crimes, people could be put to death. Many laws warned lawmakers of what to expect. Excuse me, lawbreakers. That was a Freudian slip, no doubt. A person who accidentally broke the law was just as guilty as someone who meant to break the law. This is key, folks. If you can get this into it, it is another part of getting the lock turned. If you accidentally broke the law, you were as guilty as someone who meant to break the law. The code was carved into stone and placed in public places for all to see. The laws were meant to serve as a lasting way to keep order and prevent troubles in the future. I don't know about you, but wow. Now here are some of the more famous aspects of Hammurabi's code. If anyone steal the minor son of another, he shall be put to death. If anyone is committing a robbery and is caught, then he shall be put to death. If anyone opens his ditches to water his crops, but is careless, and the water flood the field of his neighbor, then he shall pay his neighbor for his loss. If a surgeon causes the death of his patients, his hand shall be cut off. If a son strikes his father, his hand shall be cut off. Are you seeing correlation? Yeah. So the caravans and the trade, these were the ancient super interstates. Babylon became rich due to trade. Caravans traveled back and forth from the Sumerian cities to the south to the cities of Akkad in the north. Along the way, they always stopped in Babylon to trade, to rest, etc. Roads were built throughout the empire, which made travel easier and encouraged trade. Babylon had special markets called bazaars that people could go to and buy cotton cloth from Egypt. They could also buy spices from India there. So how far have we advanced? The Hittites and the Kassites. Beginning in approximately 1600 BC, the Indo-European speaking tribes invaded India. Other tribes settled in Iran and in Europe. One of these groups, the Hittites, allied itself with the Kassites, a people of unknown origin. The Kassites, I've done a study on them, very strange. Together, they conquered and destroyed Babylon. It's because the Kassites had something that the Hittites didn't. They had technology. They had a knowledge. So the Hittite power subsequently waned, but in the first half of the 14th century BC, the Hittites reemerged, controlling an area that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. The military success of the Hittites has been attributed to their monopoly in iron production and to their use of the chariot. Where did they get the chariot from? Well, we know. Nevertheless, in the 12th century BC, the Hittites were destroyed, and no great military power occupied Mesopotamia until the 9th century BC. There was a huge gap. Then emerged the Assyrians. One of the cities that flourished in the middle of the Tigris Valley during the period was that of Ashur, the name after the sun god of the Assyrians. The Assyrians were Semitic speakers who occupied Babylon for a brief period in the 13th century BC. Invasions of iron-producing peoples into the Near East and into the Aegean region in approximately 1200 BC disrupted the indigenous empires of Mesopotamia. But eventually, the Assyrians were able to capitalize on the new alignments of power in the region. Because what has been called the barbarous, unspeakable cruelty of the Assyrians, the name of such Assyrian kings as Ashurbanipal, Tiglath-Pileser, and it goes on, continue to invoke images of powerful military, brilliant, brutally savage conquerors. Folks, yeah, you think we have modern day terrorists? They are children compared to some of these tactics these people used. So, how did the Assyrians learn? Well, the capital of the Assyrian Empire was the city called Nineveh. Does that sound familiar? Nineveh became a great city of learning. It had a famous library that held thousands of clay tablets with writings from Sumer and Babylon. These records tell us a lot about life in Mesopotamia. So let's see, the Assyrians had tablets plus a library. Guess what? Now we're starting to have record keeping. The Assyrians expand. The Assyrians began to expand to the west in the earliest part of the 9th century BC. By 859, they had reached the Mediterranean Sea where they occupied Phoenician cities. Damascus and Babylon fell to the next generation of Assyrian rulers. During the 8th century BC, the Assyrians controlled over their empire appeared tenuous, but Tiglath-Pileser III seized the throne and rapidly subdued Assyria's neighbors, captured Syria, and crowned himself king of Babylon. He developed a highly proficient war machine by creating a permanent standing army under the administration of a well-organized bureaucracy. And I don't even know if I can say that one right. Sennacherib built a new city, Nineveh, on the Tigris River, destroyed Babylon, where citizens had risen in revolt, and made Judah a vassal state. Yeah. The Assyrian War Machine. The Assyrians were geniuses at waging war. They invented the battering ram, which they used to pound down city walls. They used catapults to throw rocks at enemies, and they protected their archers with helmets and armor. Chariots were used to slash their way through enemy troops. Woo! The Medes and Chaldeans. In 612 BC, revolts of subject peoples combined with the allied forces of two new kingdoms, those of the Medes and the Chaldeans, the Neo-Babylonians, effectively to extinguish Assyrian power. Nineveh was razed. The hatred that the Assyrians inspired, particularly for their policies of wholesale resettlement of subject peoples, was sufficiently great to ensure that few traces of Assyrian rule remained 2 years later. The Assyrians had used the visual arts to depict their many conquests, and Assyrian frenzies executed in minute detail continue to be the best artifacts of the Assyrian cultures. So much of what actually happened that has been borrowed by other cultures and later put into what is perceived as actual history, and it's not. The Chaldeans and the Persians. The Chaldeans became heir to Assyrian power in 612 BC, and they conquered formerly Assyrian-held lands in Syria and Palestine. King Nebuchadnezzar, 605 to 562 BC, conquered the kingdom of Judah. He destroyed Jerusalem in 586, sending the tribes of Judah into exile. Conscious of their ancient past, the Chaldeans sought to reestablish Babylon as the most magnificent city in the Near East. It was during the Chaldean period that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, famed as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, was created. Because of the estrangement of the priesthood from the king, however, the monarchy was severely weakened, and it was unable to withstand the rising power of the Achaemenians. In 539 BC, Babylon fell to Cyrus the Great, 550 to 530 BC. In addition to incorporating Babylon into the Iranian Empire, Cyrus the Great released the Jews who had been held in captivity there. So that kind of brings us to a point. This is history. This is what's been documented. This is what's known to have actually happened. And I thought this was important because it allows all of us the opportunity to gain insight in chronological order of events of this particular region that have so influenced so much of our thinking today. And again, you saw how much religion played a role way back. So religion is nothing new, but how the story of religion and how it's portrayed merely adapts to the current culture of the time that merely borrows from the past.